Okay, so before we start the story I just want to fix one thing. In the scene where we see the Hobgoblin suit and the Taskmaster suit, just imagine that the Taskmaster suit does not exist. We only see the Hobgoblin suit and not the Taskmaster suit. Okay, so now let's start the movie. We see a fat man walking into an alleyway before a hand grabs him and pulls him into the back of a van. Then the same voice that recruited Gargan asks him if he hates Spider-Man. The fat man replies with, "I don't hate him, but I just wanna find out who he is under the mask so that I can expose his true identity, and then Mr. Jameson will give me more money. I also wanna find out how Parker gets those pictures of the webhead." The man replies with, "You are perfect for the job," and we get the new boring Marvel logo, which isn't as cool as the old one. We then see Peter laying on his bed completely exhausted from all the fighting he has done. He wakes up and looks at the time. It's 10 a.m. We get a montage of him getting ready for college. He puts on his costume and swings to the school, but he sees a couple of children playing in the road and a truck is speeding towards them. Peter sees it and quickly saves the kids. He tells them to not play in the road before swinging off. We get some cool scenes of Peter swinging before he lands on top of his school, and we get that exact scene from the last movie of him crawling through the vents and entering his classroom, but this time his teacher yells at him for being late again and that he left detention without even asking. His teacher tells him to go to the principal's office. He walks to the office and the principal tells him that he is expelled and to get out of this building. Peter has no choice, so he leaves the building. He heads back to his apartment with $20 in his hand, but then his landlord opens the door and asks him for rent, and Peter says that he has only got this $20 for the rest of the month before his landlord takes it from him and slams the door in his face. He walks into his apartment before getting an alert on his phone which says that a mysterious guy with power gauntlets that blast some green stuff is robbing a bank. I want this movie to push Peter to his absolute limits. In the first few minutes of the movie he just cannot catch a break. His life is constantly going down in this movie. He quickly puts on his costume and swings to the scene. Spider-Man does not seem to crack jokes often anymore and seems more violent and also raises his voice. So, how does the fight go down? Well, he webs up the gauntlets and kicks him in the face and starts to beat the shit out of him to the point where the police have to intervene to stop Gauntlet Man from being turned into shredded human meat. The people of New York are horrified at what their friendly neighborhood Spider-Man has become. He swings off onto the top of a building wondering what happened back there. He was not himself, even he realizes it. But then a familiar voice reaches out to him. Felicia Hardy lands beside him. They talk for a few minutes and decide to check up on Feast. They run into Miles and Peter talks to him for a bit. We don't see Peter's rage affect the people around him. It's only branching out to his Spider-Man side. It has not yet reached the yelling at the people you care about level. Peter checks the time and realizes that it's time for his pizza delivery job. So he says goodbye to Miles and Felicia and reaches the area on time. Barely. His boss tells him to deliver these pizzas on time, otherwise he is fired. Peter accepts and he hops on his motorbike before seeing a couple of thugs robbing a bank. He quickly takes them out and also takes pictures of the scene, and then he goes back to his delivery job. He delivers the pizzas 15 minutes late and he also says pizza time. You know what happens next. The person who ordered the pizza doesn't pay and he gets fired from his job. He thinks that might as well cash in these pics at the Bugle. So he goes to the Bugle and sees another photographer named Eddie Brock, and he already took the pictures and framed Spider-Man for the robbery. The symbiote realizes that this must be Eddie but not their Eddie. It realizes that this version of Eddie is evil and decides to ruin his life. Peter hands in his pictures but they were not taken properly and Jameson fires him. Peter is very upset because now he has no way of paying the rent. He decides to swing around the city to ease his mind, but then he hears laughs that remind him of Norman. Then suddenly a bomb explodes right in his face and he starts falling and the symbiote starts to weaken and decides to go on a cooldown before coming back. Peter quickly regains consciousness and starts to freak out a little bit because his worst enemy is back, or so he thought. His spider sense starts going crazy and he looks around for anything suspicious before a goblin-like figure snatches him and takes him to the skies on his glider. He starts punching the figure over and over. But suddenly it drops him and he is falling, but just before he hits the ground he activates his web wings and glides for a short period of time. He starts to web swing again and looks for the goblin, but there's no trace of him. Peter is worried for Felicia and Miles because they are the two people in his life that matter to him the most. But he decides to stay cool and do some research on this guy. We see the fat man and he pulls out a walkie-talkie and says to the mysterious figure that I want to kill the spider but I want to mess with him first, damage any relationship he has. The shadowy figure he replies with he is K with that before we cut to Felicia watching the news and Peter lands on her balcony and starts talking to her about Norman and his return. Felicia is very angry at Peter for not talking to her more often and she wants to help him. She lashes out and starts yelling at Peter that he has become more of a dick lately than a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. We zoom out to see Hobgoblin perching on top of a building and spying on Peter and he says in a gritty voice, "Strike for the heart." We see Peter at the Daily Bugle and he walks up to Eddie and we get that same scene from Spider-Man 3 of him exposing Eddie and basically ruining his career. The pictures of Spider-Man doing all that robbery stuff was fake. Wow, who expected that, right? So now Jonah unfires Peter and fires Eddie. So Eddie is now pissed at Peter and wants to ruin Peter's life. We see Peter walking in the streets completely alone but then Miles places his hand on his shoulder and says, "Hi Pete." They talk for a bit but with every word Peter's voice starts to grow higher and it culminates in Peter yelling at Miles and Miles runs away completely horrified at what Peter has become. Peter climbs onto the top of a small building but Felicia lands beside him and tries to apologize but Peter doesn't wanna hear it and he yells at her and hits her as hard as he can. Peter realizes at what he has become and before he can say another word Felicia is just gone. He realizes that it's the suit. All of this started happening when he got the suit. So he goes to the bell tower to take it off and we get that exact scene from Spider-Man 3 except this time the symbiote covers him in a web-like cocoon and we get a scene similar to the Spectacular Spider-Man. When Peter has lost all hope and fully gives into the symbiote, a hand is placed on his shoulder, a familiar one. We raise the camera up to see Uncle Ben played by Tobey Maguire and Peter is just shocked. Peter tells Ben that he is terrified of being alone and that before there was always someone looking out for him. Ben replies to Peter that he was never alone and that the people he helped will always be looking out for him. Peter says, "You are right, I was never alone." The symbiote tries to talk Peter out of it but it's dealing with a fully developed Peter so it and Peter fight and Peter wins. He rips the symbiote off his body and he sees Uncle Ben fading into black as the screen also cuts to black. We see the fat man drinking the goblin serum. He throws it on the floor and it smashes. We cut to Peter on Felicia's balcony and he wants to apologize about earlier. Peter asks her to just listen. He says that he is sorry for treating her that way and that he was wrong. He says that the black suit got to him the power, he was overwhelmed by it. But before he can say another word his spider sense starts going crazy. But then a bomb very similar to the goblin's bomb from earlier, lands in the middle of Felicia's apartment and before Peter or Felicia can do anything it explodes. Okay, so yeah, I think you know what's gonna happen next because it is dark, well at least kind of dark. Peter tries to lift the rubble off him to reach Felicia and he's successful but when he checks up on Felicia she isn't moving. He looks out the window with tears in his eyes and he sees a figure on a hoverboard flying away with a trail of smoke following him. He stands there completely and utterly miserable before the police arrive on the scene and Peter has no choice but to flee. We see Miles at his house and maybe we can see a bit of his home life but that's besides the point. We see him trying to contact Peter and he is super worried for him. We then cut to Peter at his apartment completely miserable because he knows what he has to do. So he starts making the cure, the same one that he made for Norman. Maybe we see NA get a montage similar to the PS4 game except this time he is not making a suit but a cure. When he is done with the cure he suits up and stores the cure somewhere safe and swings into the night sky to look for Gobby. He stumbles up on a warehouse full of the goblin serum but it's a trap. Goblin throws a bomb at him and the left half of Peter's mask is destroyed. The fight hasn't even begun and he is already almost defeated. Gobby then starts taunting Spider-Man about how pathetic he is and basically almost kills him. But Peter is completely filled with rage and anger and dodges every punch and kick from Gobby and punches him so hard that he almost folds him in half. He pummels him to the ground and starts beating the shit out of him. He is about to kill Gobby but then he remembers the final words of Aunt May, "With great power there must also come great responsibility." Goblin is begging Peter to kill him but Peter takes out the cure and stabs it into Goblin's neck. He starts to walk away but Goblin, fully cured of his disease, takes off his mask. Peter takes a second to turn around and look at him and he is shocked. College graduate Ned leads as the Hobgoblin. Peter also takes off his mask and Ned is also in shock. So Peter explains everything to Ned, from him being the guy in the chair to the events of No Way Home and the memory spell and also why he didn't tell him and MJ who he was. But before Ned or Peter can say anything Peter's spider sense starts going crazy. A couple of Fisk's goons are here to try and kill Spider-Man and Ned. Peter quickly defeats the guys, but a defenseless Ned is stabbed by his own glider and Peter is terrified. The guy who stabbed him quickly runs away. He tries to talk to Ned to try and comfort him, but Ned on his final breath says to Peter to go talk to MJ and get back to his old life with her. And he dies in Peter's arms. We cut to the next day and there's a knock on Peter's door. He opens the door and we see Matt Murdock, obviously played by Charlie Cox, and he says to Peter, "Hey Parker, I have heard a lot about you, but I wanna ask you something. Will you help me win this war?" Peter asks him what war, and Murdock replies with, "Oh boy, you have got a lot to learn," and the screen cuts to black. And now for the mid-credits scene. So the symbiote finds its way to Eddie and we get a scene very similar to the Spectacular Spider-Man, again. Man, that show is good anyway. The symbiote talks to him and they bond over their hatred of Peter Parker and Spider-Man and they merge, becoming Venom. And now for the post-credits scene. Peter gets evicted because he hasn't paid rent in over a month. He asks Miles if he can crash at his place and he says sure Pete. So he crashes at Miles' place and Miles wants to show him something very weird. Peter is a bit confused, but suddenly Miles jumps and sticks to the ceiling. Peter smiles and he does the same thing. You may or may not have noticed that there is a lot of fan service in this movie. I want this movie to be a love letter to everything Spider-Man, just like Into the Spider-Verse and No Way Home. Since it's the middle of a trilogy, we have to take our hero to their darkest point yet, and in this movie there are a lot of consequences for his actions. Mostly for being Spider-Man though. It isn't a perfect story by any means, but I do think it's better than part 1, so yeah. Part 3 will come out soon and see you next time.